If you touch him right now, you could make it worse. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, calm and steady in a room suddenly filled with panic. The silver spoon hit the marble floor with a sharp clatter, spinning once before settling beside the table leg. 7-year-old Noah Whitmore sat rigid in his chair, his small hands frozen near his plate, his eyes distant, as if he were looking somewhere far beyond the elegant dining room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to lips. Across the table, Ethan Whitmore stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. The billionaire who controlled hospitals, medical investments, and research labs across 3 states stared at his son with a helplessness no boardroom had ever seen. "Noah," he said, his voice tight, controlled, but trembling at the edges. The boy didn't answer. His body remained perfectly still. A woman at the next table whispered, "Is he breathing?" Someone else fumbled for a phone. "Call 911. Another voice said urgently. But before anyone could move, a young waitress stepped forward. Claire Bennett had been standing 3 tables away holding a tray of iced water glasses. Moments earlier she had been invisible, just another quiet server moving through the polished rhythm of a high-end Manhattan restaurant. Now every eye in the room turned toward her. She set the tray down slowly, carefully, as if the room had suddenly become fragile. Then she walked straight to Noah. One of the restaurant managers hurried toward her, whispering sharply, "Claire, step back. Security will handle it." She didn't stop. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she knelt beside the boy's chair and studied him for 1 silent second. Then she said the sentence that froze the entire room. "Mr. Whitmore, please don't move him yet." Ethan looked down at her, stunned that a waitress had just given him an instruction. For a moment his instinct was to snap back, to demand a doctor, to call his private physician who was probably only 15 minutes away. But something in her voice stopped him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was certainty. Claire gently adjusted the angle of Noah's chair by a few inches, placing one steady hand near his shoulder without pressing. Her eyes watched the boy's breathing, counting silently. Around them, the restaurant held its breath. Outside the tall windows, rain slid slowly down the glass in quiet lines. Inside, the only sound was the faint hum of air conditioning and the soft rustle of expensive suits shifting nervously. Ethan's mind raced. 3 years of specialists. Neurologists from Boston. Pediatric experts from California. Every test money could buy. Every treatment plan carefully explained in calm clinical voices. And still none of them had been able to stop moments like this when Noah's body seemed to lock away from the world. Yet here was a waitress kneeling beside his son like she had done this before. Claire leaned slightly closer to the boy and spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Hey there, Noah." Her tone was warm, patient, almost familiar. Then she lightly tapped the edge of the table twice with her fingertips. Tap, tap. A strange rhythm. Simple, intentional. Across from her, Ethan Whitmore stared in confusion. Because for the first time in nearly 6 minutes, his son's fingers moved. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Claire saw it immediately. Noah's fingers twitched against the white tablecloth, barely more than a flutter, yet it was enough to make her eyes sharpen with focus. Around them, the restaurant remained completely still, as if every person in the room had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding in a way that boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations had never managed to cause. "Did he move?" someone whispered from a nearby table. Claire did not answer. Her attention never left the boy. Instead, she tapped the table again with the same steady rhythm. Tap, tap. Not louder, not faster, just the same calm pattern. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "Noah, you are doing great. Just listen to the sound." The boy's breathing shifted. It was subtle, but Claire noticed the change immediately. She gently adjusted the angle of his head by an inch, careful, precise, like someone who had studied this moment many times before. Ethan watched every movement. Confusion and hope battled inside his chest. 3 years of specialists had explained neurological responses using diagrams and complicated terminology. Yet none of them had ever looked this certain. "What are you doing?" Ethan finally asked quietly. Claire answered without looking up, giving his brain something familiar to follow. The room remained silent. Even the manager who had tried to stop her earlier now stood frozen near the service station. unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. Claire tapped the table again. Tap, tap. Then she leaned closer and spoke in a warm, steady tone. You are safe, Noah. Just follow the sound. Another small movement. This time the boy's hand lifted slightly from the tablecloth before settling again. A quiet gasp spread through the nearest tables. Ethan felt something inside his chest tighten sharply. He had seen doctors attempt complicated treatments using machines that cost more than most people's homes. Yet here a waitress knelt beside his son using nothing but her voice and a gentle rhythm. Seconds passed slowly. Then Noah blinked. Once. Slowly. His eyes shifted, unfocused at first, then gradually landing on the woman kneeling beside him. Claire's voice softened even more. There you go. Stay with me. She tapped the table again, slower now. Tap, tap. The boy's fingers curled slightly toward the sound. Ethan could not move. He could barely breathe. Because in 3 long years of hospital visits, tests, and failed treatments, he had never seen his son come back from an episode this calmly. Across the room, someone quietly lowered a phone that had been ready to dial emergency services. The tension began to ease, but Ethan still felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Noah's eyes remained on Claire, confused but aware, present. After a moment, she gently placed her hand flat on the table so he could see it clearly. You are okay, she said softly. The boy's breathing steadied. Ethan slowly exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding. His gaze lifted from his son to the young waitress kneeling beside the chair. She still had not looked at him. Not once. Instead, she watched Noah with the quiet patience of someone who understood that this moment mattered more than anything else in the room. And that was the moment Ethan Whitmore realized something that made his stomach turn with disbelief. This was not luck. This was not a guess. The waitress knew exactly what she was doing. For a few quiet seconds, no one in the restaurant moved. The elegant room that had been filled with polite conversations only minutes earlier now felt suspended in time. Noah Whitmore continued watching the waitress, his breathing steady, his small fingers slowly relaxing against the white tablecloth. Claire Bennett kept her voice calm and even, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. You are doing well, Noah, she said gently. Just stay with me. The boy blinked again, this time more clearly, and his shoulders softened as the tension slowly left his body. Ethan Whitmore felt the tight knot in his chest loosen slightly, but the disbelief remained. He had spent 3 years surrounded by specialists who spoke with confident authority about neurological pathways and advanced treatment plans. Yet the person who had brought his son back to awareness was a quiet waitress in a simple black uniform. Claire finally lifted her eyes and met Ethan's gaze for the first time. Her expression carried no pride and no expectation, only a quiet seriousness. He should stay seated for a minute, she said softly. Ethan nodded almost automatically, as if she had been the lead physician in the room. Around them, the guests slowly returned to their seats, whispering quietly, unsure whether they had just witnessed something medical or something close to a miracle. The restaurant manager approached carefully, his voice hesitant now. Claire, is everything under control? She gave a small nod without standing. He is stabilizing. The manager stepped back again, clearly deciding not to interfere any further. Ethan crouched beside his son, his voice gentler than anyone in the financial world had ever heard it. Hey buddy, he said quietly. Noah looked at him, still a little dazed, but present. Dad. The single word felt heavier than any speech Ethan had ever given in a boardroom. He placed a careful hand on the edge of the table, remembering the waitress's earlier warning not to move the boy too quickly. Claire watched the interaction with quiet focus, making sure the child remained calm. After another moment, she tapped the table lightly once more, slower this time, more like a closing note than a signal. Noah's eyes followed the movement. The boy's breathing had returned to a natural rhythm. Ethan turned toward her again, studying her carefully now. Up close, she looked younger than he had first assumed, perhaps in her late 20s, with steady eyes that revealed an unusual kind of patience. Not the forced patience of someone doing a job, but the calm of someone who understood something most people did not. How did you know what to do? Ethan asked quietly. Claire hesitated for a brief moment before answering. Sometimes the brain needs a simple pattern to find its way back. Her explanation sounded almost casual, yet it carried the confidence of experience. Ethan felt a new wave of curiosity rising beneath his relief. The explanation was too precise, too deliberate. This was not something a person guessed. Claire slowly stood, brushing a faint crease from her apron as if she were returning to an ordinary shift. The guests around the room continued whispering, several watching her with open amazement. One elderly man near the window shook his head softly and murmured to his wife, "That young woman just did what a room full of doctors could not." Ethan remained crouched beside his son, but his attention had shifted completely to Claire Bennett, because one fact had become impossible to ignore. The calm waitress who had just helped his child was not simply a waitress. And Ethan Whitmore had built an empire by uncovering the truth behind things that did not make sense. The room slowly returned to motion, but Ethan Whitmore remained kneeling beside his son as if the rest of the world had faded into the background. Noah sat quietly now, his small hands resting on the table, while he looked from his father to the young waitress who had just steadied his breathing. The tension that had filled the restaurant only minutes earlier had softened into cautious relief. Claire Bennett adjusted the edge of the chair slightly so the boy could sit more comfortably, her movements calm and precise. "How are you feeling now, Noah?" she asked gently. The boy blinked once, thinking carefully before answering. "Better," he said in a soft voice. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound almost a quiet laugh of disbelief. For 3 years he had listened to specialists explain that recovery after one of Noah's episodes could take hours. Yet the boy now looked alert, even curious. Claire gave a small, reassuring smile. "Your body just needed a moment to remember how to relax." Noah nodded slightly, as if that explanation made perfect sense to him. Ethan watched the exchange closely, his mind racing. The interaction between them felt strangely natural, as if this was not the first time she had guided a child through something like this. He stood slowly and faced her directly. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, his voice calm but searching. "I owe you my thanks." Claire shook her head gently. "He did the hard part himself," she replied. Her answer was simple, almost dismissive, yet Ethan noticed the way she continued observing Noah from the corner of her eye, making sure the boy remained stable. The restaurant manager approached again, now far more respectful than before. "Mr. Whitmore, we can arrange a private room if you would like a quieter space." Ethan nodded once, but kept his attention on Claire. "That will not be necessary yet." His gaze remained fixed on her, as if studying a complex puzzle. She looked like any other employee in the room. Black uniform, simple apron, hair pulled back neatly. Nothing about her appearance suggested advanced medical training. Yet everything about her actions did. "Where did you learn that technique?" he asked quietly. Claire paused for a moment, clearly weighing how much to say. Around them, the restaurant staff began restoring normal service, though many of them still glanced toward the table with curiosity. Finally, she answered with the same calm tone she had used all evening. "It is not really a technique. Sometimes children respond to rhythm better than instructions." Ethan studied her expression carefully. She had spoken like someone explaining something ordinary, yet the certainty in her voice carried the quiet authority of experience. Noah looked up at her again. "Are you a doctor?" the boy asked with innocent curiosity. Claire smiled softly and shook her head. "No. I am just someone who has spent time learning how the brain listens." The answer was gentle, but it only deepened Ethan's curiosity. Because in his world, knowledge like that came from years of specialized study, not from serving water and dinner orders. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of plates, and the quiet rhythm of the restaurant gradually returned. But Ethan Whitmore could not stop thinking about the moment he had just witnessed. The waitress who had helped his son was hiding something. Not something dangerous, but something significant. And for the first time that evening, Claire Bennett seemed to realize that Ethan had begun asking the kind of questions that powerful people never stop asking once their curiosity is awakened. For a few minutes, the restaurant slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but Ethan Whitmore could not return to his meal or his conversation. His attention remained fixed on Claire Bennett as she moved calmly through the dining room, refilling water glasses and clearing plates as if nothing unusual had happened. To everyone else, she looked like an ordinary waitress finishing her shift. But Ethan knew better. Powerful men survived by noticing details others ignored, and tonight he had seen something that refused to fit inside a simple explanation. Noah sat quietly beside him, now fully alert, slowly sipping a glass of water. The boy watched Claire move across the room with open curiosity. "She helped my head stop spinning," Noah said softly. Ethan nodded, though his eyes never left the waitress. Yes, he replied. She did. Across the room, Claire handed a dessert menu to another table and offered a polite smile before stepping back. Her movements were smooth and professional, yet Ethan noticed something different now. The same careful awareness she had shown beside Noah seemed to follow her everywhere. She noticed every small sound in the room, every shift in posture from the guests around her. It was the quiet alertness of someone trained to observe people closely. Ethan had seen that kind of awareness before, but only inside medical research labs and rehabilitation centers. The restaurant manager approached Ethan's table once again, now carrying a concerned but respectful tone. "Mr. Whitmore, I truly apologize for the disturbance earlier. If there is anything we can provide tonight, please let me know." Ethan shook his head calmly. "Your staff handled the situation better than most hospitals I have visited." The manager blinked in surprise at the comment. Ethan leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. "Tell me about Claire Bennett." The manager hesitated for a moment. "She has worked here for about a year. Quiet, reliable, never late." Ethan waited. When the man offered no further explanation, Ethan asked another question. "Before this job?" The manager gave a small, uncertain shrug. "I'm not sure. She does not talk much about her past." Ethan nodded slowly, though the lack of information only sharpened his curiosity. Across the room, Claire returned to their table carrying a fresh glass of water for Noah. She placed it carefully in front of the boy and gave him a warm smile. "You look stronger already," she said gently. Noah smiled back, clearly comfortable around her. Ethan studied the moment closely. His son usually kept distance from strangers after an episode, yet with Claire he seemed completely relaxed. "Miss Bennett," Ethan said quietly. She turned toward him with the same calm expression. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "My son has been treated by some of the most respected specialists in the country. What you did tonight, none of them have ever tried." Claire's eyes softened slightly, but she did not appear surprised by his statement. Instead, she glanced briefly at Noah, making sure he remained comfortable. "Doctors focus on complex answers," she said quietly. "Sometimes the brain responds better to simple ones." The explanation sounded modest, but Ethan recognized something hidden beneath her words. Experience. Real experience. The kind that came from long hours beside patients, not from reading textbooks. Claire stepped back politely, preparing to return to her other tables. But before she could turn away, Ethan spoke again. His voice carried the quiet authority that had built a business empire. "Miss Bennett, I would very much like to understand how you learned something like that." Claire paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table. For the first time that evening, a faint shadow of hesitation crossed her face. And in that brief silence, Ethan Whitmore realized the answer he was searching for might be far more complicated than he had expected. Claire Bennett did not answer immediately. The hesitation lasted only a second, but Ethan Whitmore noticed it with the precision of a man who had spent his life reading people across negotiation tables. Her hand rested lightly against the back of Noah's chair, steady and calm, yet something in her eyes shifted. Not fear, not discomfort, something closer to memory. She glanced down at the boy again before finally speaking. "It is nothing special, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "Just something I learned a long time ago." Ethan studied her carefully. Powerful men often heard excuses, but this did not sound like one. It sounded like someone deliberately choosing which parts of a story to leave unsaid. Noah looked up at her with curiosity. "How did you know my head was going to feel better?" he asked in the simple, direct way only children could. Claire smiled gently and leaned slightly closer so he could hear her clearly. "Because sometimes the brain just needs a path back," she said softly. "And rhythm can help it find that path." The explanation sounded simple, but Ethan felt the same quiet certainty behind her words that he had heard earlier when she told him not to move his son. Claire straightened slowly and stepped back from the table, allowing the moment to settle. Around them, the restaurant had nearly returned to normal. Glasses clinked softly. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays. But the quiet tension from earlier had not disappeared entirely. Several guests still glanced toward Claire when she passed. Ethan finally spoke again. "You speak about the brain like someone who has studied it." Claire met his gaze for a brief moment. Her expression remained calm, yet the answer came slowly. "Life teaches many things." Ethan almost smiled at the careful response. It was the kind of answer someone gave when the truth was complicated. Noah reached for his glass of water again, now completely steady. Claire watched the small movement with quiet satisfaction. After a moment, she turned slightly, preparing to return to her other tables. But Ethan's voice stopped her again. "Miss Bennett." She paused. Ethan lowered his tone, speaking more quietly so the nearby guests could not easily hear. "My son has seen neurologists in Boston, Chicago, and San Diego. Some of the best specialists in the country. None of them have ever used a method like that." Claire's eyes softened for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a faint trace of something deeper than professionalism. Sometimes experts forget that the brain listens before it understands. Ethan felt a small chill run through his thoughts. That sentence did not come from a textbook. It sounded like something learned beside a hospital bed during long nights of watching and waiting. Claire finally lifted the tray she had set aside earlier and balanced it easily in one hand. "Your son is doing well now," she said gently. "But if he feels tired later tonight, that is normal." Ethan nodded slowly, committing every detail to memory. The calm authority in her voice had become impossible to ignore. Claire gave Noah one last reassuring smile before stepping away from the table. She moved back into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant as though she had never been the center of attention at all. Ethan remained standing beside his son, watching her walk across the dining room. And for the first time since Noah's diagnosis 3 years earlier, a thought began forming in his mind. Perhaps the answer he had been searching for was not in another hospital or another expensive consultation. Perhaps the answer had just walked away carrying a tray of empty glasses. Claire Bennett moved quietly through the dining room, but Ethan Whitmore continued watching her long after she had stepped away from their table. In business, he had built an empire by following instincts that others ignored, and tonight that instinct refused to let the moment go. The calm certainty in her voice, the precise rhythm she had used, the way Noah had responded almost immediately. None of it matched the explanation of an ordinary waitress. Noah sat comfortably beside him now, slowly eating a small piece of bread that had been placed on the table earlier. The boy looked up at his father with the relaxed expression Ethan had not seen in weeks. "Dad," Noah said softly. She made the buzzing in my head stop. Ethan felt the words settle heavily in his thoughts. Buzzing. That was exactly how Noah had once described the sensation before his neurologist explained the overstimulation patterns that sometimes overwhelmed his brain. Yet Claire had understood it without needing a single medical chart. Ethan leaned back in his chair, still thinking, when he noticed something small but unexpected. Noah's eyes were not on his plate. They were following Claire across the room as she stopped beside another table. The boy seemed calm, almost curious, the way children looked at someone they trusted. Ethan studied that reaction carefully. Trust was not something Noah offered easily. The episodes had made him cautious around strangers. But with Claire there had been no hesitation at all. Across the room, Claire finished clearing a table and carried a tray toward the service station. For a moment she paused near the kitchen doors, resting one hand against the counter as though gathering her thoughts before continuing her shift. The brief pause revealed something Ethan had not noticed earlier. A quiet tiredness behind her steady posture. Not the exhaustion of a busy evening, but the kind that came from carrying something much heavier for a long time. Ethan stood slowly. The decision came naturally, the same way he made decisions during major acquisitions. When something important appeared, you did not wait for it to disappear. "Stay here for a moment, Noah," he said gently. The boy nodded, perfectly content to sit with his glass of water. Ethan walked across the dining room with calm, deliberate steps. Several guests glanced at him as he passed, recognizing the well-known businessman, but he did not notice them. His attention remained fixed on Claire. She turned slightly as he approached, clearly aware of his presence before he spoke. "Mr. Whitmore," she said politely. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her, lowering his voice so their conversation remained private. "My son trusts you," he said quietly. Claire looked past him for a moment toward the table where Noah sat. A small smile appeared when she saw the boy watching them. "He is a brave kid," she replied softly. Ethan nodded once. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment Noah's fingers first moved. "Miss Bennett, have you ever worked in a hospital?" The question lingered in the air between them. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the tray resting against the counter. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried the calm of someone choosing her words carefully. "A long time ago," she said quietly. Ethan felt his instincts sharpen instantly, because that single sentence confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning. The waitress who had helped his son was not simply someone who had learned a helpful trick. She had once belonged to a world of medicine and healing. And for reasons Ethan Whitmore did not yet understand, she had walked away from it. Claire Bennett's answer lingered quietly between them. "A long time ago." The words were simple, but Ethan Whitmore recognized the weight behind them. People did not leave the world of medicine without a reason. He had funded hospitals, research labs, and medical training programs across the country. He knew how difficult it was to walk away from years of study and purpose. Claire adjusted the tray in her hands and looked toward the dining room again, making sure none of her other tables needed attention. The restaurant had almost returned to its usual elegance. Soft music floated through the air. Conversations resumed in low voices. Yet the space between them still carried the quiet echo of what had happened earlier beside Noah's chair. Ethan spoke again, his voice calm but direct. "You handled my son's episode with more confidence than most specialists." Claire gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if acknowledging the truth without fully accepting the compliment. "Confidence is not always the same as expertise," she replied gently. Ethan studied her face carefully. She did not sound defensive. She sounded careful. The kind of careful someone used when they were protecting a story they were not ready to tell. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire glanced past Ethan again, toward Noah's table. The boy was watching them with open curiosity, swinging his feet slightly beneath the chair now that the tension had passed. A faint warmth softened Claire's expression. "He recovers quickly," she said quietly. "That is a very good sign." Ethan followed her gaze. Seeing Noah relaxed like that still felt unfamiliar after years of uncertainty. When he looked back at Claire, his voice carried a deeper sincerity than before. "Miss Bennett, you did more for my son in 2 minutes than most doctors have managed in months." Claire shifted the tray slightly against the counter, almost as if preparing to return to work. "Sometimes progress happens when someone finally listens to what a child is trying to say," she answered softly. Ethan felt that sentence settle deep in his thoughts. It was the kind of insight that came from long experience, not theory. He lowered his voice again. "What happened?" Claire looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What do you mean?" Ethan chose his words carefully. "You said you worked in a hospital a long time ago. People who understand the brain the way you do usually stay in that field." The question hung in the air. Claire's gaze drifted briefly toward the tall windows where rain continued sliding down the glass in slow lines. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but something softer lived beneath it. "Life changes directions sometimes," she said quietly. Ethan recognized the answer for what it was. Not a lie, but not the full truth either. Across the room, Noah lifted his hand and waved slightly at Claire. She smiled and waved back before looking at Ethan again. For the first time that evening, her expression carried a small hint of something like hesitation. "Your son should rest tonight," she said gently. His brain worked very hard. Ethan nodded slowly, but his attention had already shifted toward a different thought. He had built his entire career by recognizing rare talent when it appeared. And tonight something extraordinary had appeared in the most unexpected place. As Claire turned to return to her tables, Ethan Whitmore realized that the quiet waitress walking away might hold a piece of the answer he had been searching for during the last 3 years. And he had no intention of letting that answer disappear. Claire Bennett walked back into the rhythm of the restaurant, carrying her tray from table to table with the same quiet focus she had shown all evening. Yet Ethan Whitmore remained standing near the service counter long after their conversation ended. Something about her final answer continued echoing in his thoughts. Life changes directions sometimes. It was a simple sentence, but Ethan knew from experience that simple sentences often hid complicated stories. Across the room, Noah Whitmore waited patiently at the table, gently tapping the edge of his glass with one finger, as if remembering the rhythm Claire had used earlier. Ethan returned to him slowly and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Noah looked up and said in a calm voice, "Dad, my head feels quiet now." Ethan felt those words settle deeply in his chest. Quiet. That was the word Noah had rarely used during the past 3 years. Doctors had described treatments in technical language, but none of them had managed to bring quiet back to the boy's mind the way Claire had. Ethan placed his hand gently on the table near Noah's plate. "That is very good to hear," he said softly. Noah looked across the room again, searching for Claire. "Will she come back?" he asked. Ethan followed his gaze. Claire was speaking politely with another table, writing down an order while the guests smiled and thanked her. To anyone else, she looked like an ordinary waitress finishing an ordinary shift. But Ethan knew the truth was far more complicated than that. "Maybe," Ethan replied thoughtfully. A few minutes passed as the restaurant returned fully to its calm evening atmosphere. Then Claire approached their table one last time. She carried the bill folder and placed it gently beside Ethan's plate. "Whenever you are ready, Mr. Whitmore," she said kindly. Ethan did not reach for the check immediately. Instead, he looked up at her with a quiet seriousness that made Claire pause. "Miss Bennett," he said slowly, "I have spent 3 years searching for answers for my son." Claire remained silent, waiting. Ethan continued in the calm, measured tone that had persuaded investors and medical boards across the country. "Tonight you gave me something none of the specialists have managed to give him. Relief." Claire glanced briefly at Noah, who smiled shyly up at her. The warmth in her expression returned instantly. "He did most of the work himself," she said gently. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging her humility, but he did not allow the moment to end there. "You said life changed directions," he said quietly. "Sometimes it can change again." Claire's eyes met his for a moment, curious but cautious. Ethan leaned slightly forward and spoke the thought that had been forming since the moment Noah's fingers first moved. "I would like to ask you something important, Miss Bennett." The restaurant around them continued its soft conversations and clinking glasses, completely unaware that the next words might change several lives at once. Ethan Whitmore looked at the quiet waitress who had walked away from medicine long ago and said calmly, "Would you consider helping my son again tomorrow?"